Ukrainian forces face an escalating assault on the east. As Russian troops regroup on Ukraine's eastern border, will Kiev be able to stop their advance? I'm Andrij Dobriansky, and today's newsmaker is Russia's ambitions in eastern Ukraine. Now, when Russian forces attacked Ukraine in February, some thought victory would be swift, given Moscow's military might. But 7 weeks later, thousands are dead, millions displaced, and the conflict rages on. It seems the Russian assault hasn't gone exactly to plan for the Kremlin, and now it appears to be changing course. Its troops are refocusing their efforts on eastern Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin has appointed a new top commander. His name is Alexander Dvornikov, and he has a brutal reputation.
He and other senior Russian leaders have shown in the past, and you mentioned Syria as one example, have shown clearly in the past their disregard for avoiding civilian harm. Their utter disregard in many ways for the laws of war, laws of armed conflict, and the brutality with which they conduct and prosecute their operations. There's a track record here before Ukraine of Russian brutality. And you've seen it on display every single day of the last 46 days.
Let's take a closer look at the man who may now be making the calls on the battlefield of the Donbass. Alexander Dvornikov joined the Soviet armed forces at the age of 17 and has held several top positions in the Russian army since. But it was 2015 in Syria where he gained international notoriety. Dvornikov played a prominent role in the Russian offensive that gave the Assad regime the upper hand. In 2016, he was honored as a hero of the Russian Federation for overseeing Moscow's campaign in Syria. The Russian general has also worked with the Wagner Group, a Russian private military company active in Ukraine, Syria, and several African nations. The Wagner Group has been repeatedly accused of war crimes and human rights abuses. Recently, Dvornikov has been overseeing troops in Ukraine's south and east, and he has extensive experience in Ukraine's Donbass region. Well, it's impossible to predict exactly what Russia is planning, but according to the UK's Ministry of Defense, fighting in the east will intensify over the next 2 to 3 weeks. On Friday, at least 50 people were killed after 2 rockets hit a busy train station in the eastern city of Kramatorsk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said it was a deliberate attack on civilians. The Russian Defense Ministry denied it was to blame. In fact, they say Kiev is responsible.
Today, on April the 8th, the Ukrainian military struck the railway station of Kramatorsk with a Tochka-U missile. The missiles, which remains were found near the railway station, are used only by the Ukrainian military.
Meanwhile, in the besieged port city of Mariupol, Russia is once again accused of committing atrocities. Kiev says Moscow has been using chemical weapons after some inside Mariupol developed breathing problems. Western powers, including the US and the UK, say they're looking into the reports. And Britain's Minister for Armed Forces, James Heappey, warned that if chemical weapons have been used, nothing is off the table.
To be clear, we are working urgently to understand whether or not chemical weapons have been used. And if they have, as the Foreign Secretary has said, the people responsible will be held to account. The use of chemical weapons is abhorrent. It does cross a line, and all options are on the table for how we would respond.
But Russian officials have accused the West of trying to derail peace talks by using those accusations of war crimes. And while speaking to Russian state TV, Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov explained what Moscow's aims are in Ukraine.
Our special military operation is aimed at bringing an end to the reckless expansion and to the reckless striving for domination of the United States and the other Western countries under their influence on the global stage.
Well, some say Sergey Lavrov's words highlight the psychological complex Russia is dealing with and how it could drive Moscow's military strategy in Ukraine. Joining me now to discuss what's happening in the east of the country are, from New York, political analyst Andrij Dobriansky. He is also the chair of UN Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. Sergey Markov joins us from Moscow. He is a former member of the Russian Parliament. And from London, Elisabeth Braw. She is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks all so much for being with us. Andrij, let me start with you. I mean, at this point, do you think Russia has indeed scaled back some of its operations, and given up on a kind of broader goal to either take Ukraine or at least topple the government in order to focus on annexing Donbass, maybe move toward Odessa, and possibly on to Transnistria in Moldova?
I don't think it's possible at this point, given the severe military losses that Russia has had in Ukraine, to consider anything more than what they currently occupy. Their struggle for the considerable future, whether that's towards the end of the year, as the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States is hinting that this struggle will be bloody and long and prolonged in the east of Ukraine. But getting more territory in Ukraine now is a failed venture for Russia. Frankly, to call it a war is kind of a misnomer. It's really a bloody attack against civilians, especially against women and children. So what we're really seeing are war crimes more so than a conventional war.
Okay, let me ask Sergey if you're on the same page there. I mean, is it a failed venture for Russia? Because some say we have to remember that Russia rarely loses. I mean, even when it lost the first Chechen war, it came back to win in Dagestan and then win the second Chechen war. And before and since then, minus Afghanistan, different story entirely, really, but Russia's never lost what it's gone after.
That's right. Because Russia sometimes lost its war when it has some kind of attempt to occupy another countries, like Finland in 1939 or Afghanistan in the end of the 20th century. And after this, Russia has partly withdrawn its troops. But when Russia defended itself, Russia usually wins. It's exactly here. The situation with case is Ukraine. You may know that Kyiv is first Russian capital, and you may know that 80% of the people in Ukraine, they speak Russian language. Most of them see big, great Russia as the, in fact, motherland, and Ukraine as part of big Russia. And now we regard Ukraine as occupied country, and occupied by United States of America. So Russia is making liberation of Ukrainian people. And this occupation used very tough measures, terror, in fact, political terror against all political opponents, and using neo-Nazi group for such political terror. Okay. So Russian main goal is to stop formation of anti-Russia from Ukraine, then to stop political terror and to liberate these people. Russia will enter only those regions where people like Russia to enter. Okay. It means Western Ukraine, no. Eastern, Southern Ukraine, yes.
Okay. Elisabeth, let me ask you about that, because it says Western Ukraine, no. But the fact is Russia went in there too, destroyed so much, thousands died. But do you think in hindsight now that also could have been somehow planned in order to wreak havoc, pretty quickly in areas that it knows it can't really take and doesn't quite want to, and then move on to eastern Ukraine when there's a level of exhaustion and they can find more support possibly to achieve their ultimate goals?
Well, I think you have to differentiate between political goals and military goals. No military commander would ever want to invade a country knowing that the troops won't be able to achieve the task set given to them. So I highly doubt that the Russian generals would have agreed to this scenario, knowing that their forces would be so surprisingly defeated, you might say, in the Kyiv area by the Ukrainians. Now, politically, it could well be, as you say, Whereas you suggest that President Putin may not care whether his armed forces do badly as long as they inflict terror and suffering on the Ukrainian population and in fact, on the Ukrainian economy as well, which is now in free fall. If you don't care about the civilian losses that your war will bring, then you may well take that into account and say, actually, that's an advantage to what I'm trying to achieve. But nevertheless, now Russia is looking at potential territorial conquests that are quite a bit smaller than they had originally set out to conquer. And so in a sense, it's humiliation for President Putin. But if his goal, on the other hand, was to cause suffering to Ukraine, he has certainly achieved that goal too.
Okay. I mean, let me come back to Andrij, because if it is a failed venture that you think up to this point, perhaps, they now have a new general in charge of this eastern offensive, Alexander Dvornikov. Do you think anyone would identify him then as a potential game changer in this conflict? Because a number of military analysts actually say he was the game changer for Russia in Syria.
And what happened in Syria were serial war crimes, the likes of which are being even protested within Russia itself, with the Wagner Group attempting to be prosecuted by citizens in Russian courts. What Dvornikov has done around the world is commit war crimes. This is not a military commander, and it is not wreaking havoc when Russia is launching rockets at the rest of Ukraine, where you proposed that they weren't going to take over. They are committing terrorist acts. They are launching rockets. For instance, last week they launched a rocket attack against a fuel depot in Odessa, and the civilians in the surrounding countryside were killed. That is a terror
Andrij,
attack.
I mean, we've seen that. I mean, and the United Nations, in a number of investigations now, would support what you argue on that front. But the bottom line is, particularly in Syria, I mean, you say, yes, war crimes have been committed, but Assad is still there. And that's what Russia wanted. And that's what maybe Ukrainians are most worried about, that this war of attrition, no matter what atrocities may be committed, Russia will eventually get what it wants, especially with such a general in control.
Correct. And the Syria analogy is quite potent, given what we've seen already in Mariupol. The strategy for Russia is not to claim Ukrainians. The strategy is to occupy land. And to do that, Russia will do three things. One, it will kill civilians on that land. Two, it will scare them away to run to other countries. Or three, it will put them on buses and take them back into Russia, as already over 100,000 children have been absconded by Russian authorities. This is what Russia wants. What we saw in Syria, which is the complete leveling of cities where people do not live there anymore, and yet Assad controls whatever you want to call that in the aftermath. That is the strategy of this so-called general that he will be bringing to the east of Ukraine.
Okay, Sergey, what is your opinion on this general? I mean, do you think he's a war criminal, as Andrij says, or is he a particularly talented military strategist that will get what Russia wants in Ukraine?
It's not Alexander Dvornikov war criminal. It's Andrij Dobriansky is propaganda criminal. And he supports terrorists. The main problem for Russia now is that Ukrainian troops Ukrainian army use terroristic tactic in the tremendous scale. In fact, Russian defense ministry regards that almost more than 4 million civilians have now, in fact, used by Ukrainian army as hostages, as human shield. It's the main problem for Russian army. Russian army much more strong than Ukrainian army. But how to crash Ukrainian army without killing a lot of civilians who is our people? They are Russian speaking. Most of these civilians dream to live in Russia. They dream to have Vladimir Putin as their president. And how to save these lives, but same time to crash these, in fact, terroristic organizations, which is stated to be Ukrainian army under the leadership of the fascist neo-Nazi officers and American generals. It's a very strong combination. Ukrainian army is Russian soldier and fascist officer and American general. It's a very strong combination. And how to crash it when they use 4 million as hostage, when they're ready to kill own citizens as they kill Ukrainian citizens in Bucha, in Kramatorsk. How to deal with this? It's very difficult military task. And Dvornikov, who fighted against Syria, against terrorists in Syria, probably maybe more professional than this.
Right, Sergey, I mean, the clock is against us, so my apologies for having to interrupt at times. But I mean, let me turn to Elisabeth, because when you hear Sergey Markov say there that the propaganda and the war crimes are really on the other side, we heard Sergey Lavrov say what he thought of the threat of the West, striving for influence. Do you think it shows, a real psychological complex that, Russia's sense of pride just cannot accept that maybe it's not wanted in areas where it used to dominate, and that it will fight to get that dominance back at any cost?
Well, if you think of a schoolyard and there is a bully, and the bully gains supremacy in the schoolyard by bullying other kids, and he thinks he has friends, but in reality those kids are frightened of him, and the moment they get the chance, they sort of leave his company and find better friends, and then yes, he will be offended because he'll discover he has no friends, and in a sense that's what has happened to Russia, and I think we all wish that Russia would if it wants to increase its power in the world, they would go about it in a friendly way and try to win countries over by showing respect and by showing giving them, for example, diplomatic, by having closer diplomatic relations, by showing friendship, just like any other country has done that has built alliances, lasting alliances over the years. But clearly this is not Russia's way, and this is a tragedy that by seeking to increase its power in the world, it's actually decreasing it, because even fewer countries want close relations with Russia, want allegiance to Russia these days. And as a result, it's not just strengthening NATO, it's strengthening China, its other main rival. So it's a tragedy for lots of civilians in Ukraine and beyond, but also for Russia itself, because now it doesn't stand a chance of gaining that prominence that it thought it was going to get through this ill-fated operation.
I mean, Sergey, just quickly, do you accept at all that Russia has, as Elisabeth was outlining there, in a sense, this schoolyard bully complex? Because people are asking, why can't Russia just focus on the gigantic territory and huge population that's within its own borders?
Russia concentrating on those territories because these territories is populated by people who want to be in Russia, who speak Russian language, who regard Russia as a motherland, and who wants to see Vladimir Putin, but not American puppet Vladimir Zelensky as their president. That's why Russia liberating those people, first of all. And also, I'm very much surprised when our colleague used different psychological terms in trying to describe Russian behavior. Because, sorry, colleagues, we are don't interesting about your respect. Absolutely. We know that you hate us because we are strong and independent. We just demand, don't kill people, don't occupy another country, don't see yourself as a master of the global world. We will be independent, you will have to accept it. Okay. And also that Vladimir Putin wants somebody to respect him. It's a joke. Vladimir Putin, it's not small boy with psychological complex. He's very rational and very experienced, one of the most experienced in the world political leader. He don't interesting about no any respect and so on. He interesting that Russia future should be preserved by Russians.
Okay, Andrij, I have to ask you as the Ukrainian on the panel, I mean, how do you engage in dialogue when this is Russia's stance?
This is not something that it begs the question of why are we even listening to this perspective, or why do we even bring up the analogy of a school bully? Why do we talk about Russian pride? When Russian soldiers go into small Ukrainian villages, take Ukrainian women, and rape them to the point of not being able to bear any more children or being disgusted by the sight of another man in the future. That is what they yell at them when they repeatedly rape them. This is what is happening in Ukraine. This is not anything to do with Russian pride. This has nothing to do with the complex of a schoolyard bully. These are pure
But
war
Andrij,
crimes.
when you're talking about having to enter into diplomatic negotiations, you're going to have to talk about these issues. This is the complex you're up against. There are
these people will.
Go ahead.
Yeah, these people will be hunted down as war criminals for the next several decades. That's the realistic future. Every single war crime that has been committed, they will be hunted down no matter which country they try to find harbor in. These people are they've created the Anschluss. They've created the genocide in Ukraine, and they will be held accountable. If not held accountable, then there will be no justice in the world. And what is the point of any of this?
Okay, unfortunately, we've seen a lack of justice across many war zones on the planet. We have to hope that won't be the case maybe in this instance. But let me ask you, Andrij, quickly, if you think at present Western pressure, its supply of weapons, even all the negative press, do you think it's serving as any kind of deterrent at all?
It's about closing the circle around Russia. We just learned that they defaulted on their sovereign debt. The longer they try to keep afloat this house of cards, that is their economy, the less likely it will be able for them to have any international relations, no matter what they try to do. So, so long as the pressure continues, and the more war crimes we see, the more pressure will continue.
Okay, Elisabeth, I have to ask you about this angle as well, because we have been hearing more and more about countries like Sweden and Finland formally perhaps bidding to join NATO at this point. What do you make of that in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
It's surely the most ironic outcome anybody could have thought of. Vladimir Putin set about invading Ukraine to expand Russian power, and he's getting the opposite, not just resistance, fierce resistance from the Ukrainians, but also a complete reversal in public attitudes. In Finland in particular, which has for so long been a country that was reluctant to join NATO, it wanted to remain militarily non-aligned, and now we are seeing public support for NATO rising from the mid-20s to the 68% most recently. Remarkable. And the country will make a decision now within the next few weeks on whether to apply for NATO membership. And if the Finns apply, and they are certainly to be followed by the Swedes, the two countries are likely to be invited at the Madrid summit at the end of June. A completely paradoxical outcome, but one that will certainly benefit NATO, which is, of course, what Putin didn't want.
Okay, Sergey, what will Moscow do if Finland and Sweden, you know, historically neutral countries? It seems we've lost Sergey. There, no, he's back. So what will Moscow do if Finland and Sweden formally bid to join NATO?
Nothing. We don't care about this. Both Sweden and Finland had already backside treaty with NATO, which it in fact makes them almost members of NATO in the
But Sergey, how do you say you don't care about this when Sergey Lavrov has just said that, you know, the reckless expansion, this reckless striving for domination of Western countries moving towards our borders? I mean, Finland has a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, and now you're saying you don't care if NATO expands to that border?
We don't care because we regard Finland as almost member of NATO, which NATO can use the territory what goes with the NATO wants. So the situation didn't change dramatically. The main thing what we should do, we can see that anti-Russia is forming by United States, by Britain, using dozens of millions of Russian people who live in Ukraine. And we want to stop this anti-Russia, which is doing by methods of terror, and we will stop it.
Okay. Andrij, I can give you 1 minute for quick final words.
I think when you bring up what's happening in Scandinavia and those countries and the fact that there is no Russian response to that, similar to Ukraine, this goes back again to the concept of genocide, the fact that Russia does not consider Ukrainian people to be at their level, which is why we are seeing the war crimes happening in Ukraine. That is the key difference.
Okay. Elisabeth, about 30 seconds.
The loss of Finland is really quite remarkable, or the pending loss of Finland, which has for so long been a country that has been lived in dialogue with Russia, in close relations with Russia, even when it was free to do as it wished after the end of the Cold War. To see Finland be on its way into NATO is really a remarkable change, and one that it's not that's not going to go over well in Russia. But Finland doesn't care.
Okay. Elisabeth Braw, Sergey Markov, and Andrij Dobriansky, thank you all so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.